Hello everyone. Hello everyone. Very good afternoon and welcome to the STEM Graduate Colloquium. This Graduate Colloquium is brought to you by SPMS Graduate Students Club and IAS. Today we have Professor Sandra Diaz as our speaker. Professor Sandra completed her PhD from National University of Cordoba in 1989, following which she moved to University of Sheffield for her postdoc. During her research career, she developed protocols to support scientists using functional traits to interpret ecosystems. She was also the first one to demonstrate the impact of carbon dioxide on soils. According to some sources, she is among the top 1% most cited scientists in the world. Currently, she is a professor at Cordoba National University and investigator superior at CONICET. She is also the founder and director at the international initiative Nucleodiversus on Diversity and Sustainability. Professor Sandra is also interested in social sciences and looks how societies value and support ecosystems. Today, the title of her talk is Links Between Nature and People from 1970 to 2030, the IPBES Global Assessment Report. So let's welcome Professor Sandra Diaz.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I'm very grateful to my host, Professor David Warner, and also to the Asian School of the Environment and the NTU Smithsonian Partnership. Today, I would like to give you a flavor, the key messages of a very recent report of the links between nature and people in the past 50 years and looking at the next 30 years. This is the Global Assessment Report of Ibis. For those of you who are not familiar with this horrible acronym, Ibis means the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's an intergovernmental body which assesses biodiversity, ecosystems, and what they mean to people, which is similar to the IPCC, but with emphasis on biodiversity. Is it too loud? Okay. Okay, so this report was finished in May. The co-chairs are three of us. Joseph Cetelier from Germany, Eduardo Brondicio from Brazil and the US, and myself. And this is our super heroic technical support unit, Hien Go and Mac Geze. And this is the core group, but indeed the report was the product of more than 450 experts around the world. Now, you may say, okay, well, this is yet another report, one out of many that came out in the past couple of years. Well, not quite. The reason I say it's not quite another report is because this one was the first intergovernmental one on biodiversity and ecosystem contributions to people. There were representatives of 51 countries, a higher representative of the social science ever in an environmental report, still more natural sciences, but more than ever before, the proportion of social and interdisciplinary scientists, the first one to go this far in incorporating the knowledge of indigenous communities and local communities. It went through 3 rounds of open review on the internet. Everyone in the universe could give comments. 3 years and amounted approximately 156,000 hours of voluntary work. So I guess I hope it doesn't sound like too much self-promotion to say that this is probably one of the most comprehensive assessments on biodiversity and people ever carried out. The full report is really, really fat. It's about 1,500 pages. But the gist of it, you can have in these two new products. The first one is the summary for policymakers. This contains in only 40 pages the essence of what was approved by the governments. Now, if you are interested in knowing the key messages in the language for policymakers that was word by word adopted by the countries, with all the recommendations for policy, etc., then you would probably want to go for this one. If you prefer the language of science and have things packaged in the way science is normally write and think, and with the same essence, but with a little bit more highlight in the novelties, then you probably want to read this one, this review in science that came out just before Christmas. Both products have the same essence, and both are freely downloadable from the Ibis website. Now, I would like to share with you some of the key messages. The first one, and probably the most important key message, is that nature and its contributions are essential for the life of all people in the world. People, no matter where they live, are inextricably linked with the fabric of life. The fabric of life is all the interconnected living world that it's all around us and inside us. We depend on nature for the material support for our physical and social continuity. Nature underpins all the dimensions of human health. Nature provides inspiration for our discoveries, for our images, for our stories. Nature is essential to support our identities. We are not really ourselves without nature. Now, however obvious this deep dependence on nature may be, in practice, it doesn't seem to have been incorporated, because the second key message we have is that nature and its contributions to people are decreasing fast worldwide. It's true that in the past 50 years, we produce more energy and materials and food than ever before in human history. But this has come at a high price. We assessed in a systematic review 18 different categories, general categories of nature's contributions to people. And we found that 14 of the 18 have decreased substantially worldwide. This increased production of energy, of food, of materials has come at the cost of a sharp decline in the capacity of nature to regulate our environment, the capacity of ecosystems to regenerate themselves, and the capacity of nature to provide non-material contributions to people. And it's also jeopardizing nature's capacity to provide all contributions, including the material ones, in the future. The global decline of these present and future benefits from nature is because the fabric of life itself has deteriorated fast. And it's not only that the fabric of life has become in a smaller version of itself, a smaller but representative version of itself. It's much more non-random than that. Nature, the fabric of life, is getting increasingly thinner, simpler, and more frayed. virtually all the indicators of the global state of nature are deteriorating, from biomes to genomes. Starting with biomes and ecosystems, the biosphere and the atmosphere have been deeply reconfigured by humans. These are just some numbers. You can pick your favorite one. Actually, if we look at the remaining intact systems, by intact we don't mean empty, we mean systems which has fragments which are continuous at least of 5,000 hectares with no human impact detectable through remote sensing, you see they're very, very small worldwide. We cannot really concentrate only on them. We need to concentrate also on the rest of nature. Indeed, when you look at this, you realize that now nature has indeed become human nature. This at the level of biomes and ecosystems. What about smaller levels? What about the level of species? We found that more species of plants and animals are threatened today with extinction than at any other time in human history. And the global rates of extinction is at least tens to hundreds of times faster than the average over the last 10 million years. So that's well beyond human times. These are the extinction rates of some major groups. Yeah. And this, here this is background extinction rate, and these are the new extinction rates. This is mostly for wild species. But the picture is not that different from domesticated species. There is a sharp decrease in the number of local varieties of domesticated plants and a similar picture of domesticated animals, with probably strong consequences for the resilience of food systems and therefore food security and sovereignty. Even the evolutionary process itself has been significantly shaped by us in the past 50 years. Many people, particularly non-biologists, used to think that evolution is something that happens over long periods of time, thousands or millions of years. Something that, the dinosaurs and then us. But of course, scientists have known for a long time that evolution is happening all the time and can be really fast. But now we have found a very large number of well-documented cases of fast evolution happen now as a response of human pressures. Everybody's probably familiar with the evolution of resistance to antibiotics or the evolution of resistance in weeds in agriculture. But the fast evolution is now happening in all sorts of organisms in response to harvesting, in response to climate change, in response to infrastructure, etc. In some cases, it benefits us, but in most cases, it's not a benefit for us. And there's very little we can do about it. We can manage for it, but we cannot stop it. Now, ours is the first intergovernmental report for policymakers that mentions evolution. And when we wanted to do something about evolution in the report, we had a bit of an initial resistance because people said, this is too, blue sky, evolution. But when we sort of stayed put and presented the evidence, and policymakers were particularly interested in seeing them because, as we predicted, most of them were sort of aware that species are dying, but very, very few were aware of evolution happening this way. Now, all these very strong changes in nature are the product of a number of drivers of change accelerating dramatically during the past 50 years. It's not that they are new, they've been happening since human history, but they just took an acceleration since the 70s. And we divide the drivers in two categories. First, the direct drivers, the proximate causes of change. And we did a very, very thorough, systematic review of the importance of different drivers of change at the global level. And these are the main drivers in decreasing order of global importance in the last 50 years. First, land and sea use change. Second, direct exploitation of organisms, meaning fishing, hunting, selective logging. Third, climate change. Fourth, pollution. And fifth, invasive alien species. As you can see, climate change doesn't come first if we consider 50 years, but is increasingly becoming more important in the last couple of decades. And all these drivers interact with each other, often synergizing each other's effect. And of course, the relative importance of these drivers changes with the region. This is the global mean, if you want. Now, not all of the human impacts on biodiversity are negative. I mentioned that we went further than ever before in incorporating the knowledge and the values and the perspective of indigenous peoples and local communities in a very systematic way, not just a little box there and here. And one of the ways in which we benefit from incorporating all this new thread of knowledge is that we were able to document a very large number of cases all over the world in which traditional practices not only don't harm biodiversity, not only maintain it, in some cases it enhances it. All the way from landscapes to genetic diversity of domesticated organisms. And this incorporation of the practices and the perspective of indigenous people and local communities is important for a number of reasons. They manage a very large proportion of global land, and they manage a disproportionately high percentage of the highly conserved ecosystems. I think yesterday a new paper came out in Frontiers in Ecology and Environment showing the strong overlap between intact wilderness and indigenous lands. And they manage most of the local agrobiodiversity in the world. It seems nature, all the indicators of nature, seems to be declining less rapidly in indigenous territories, but of course, even within them, most of the local indicators are also decreasing. They're just not decreasing as fast as outside their lands. So, because of those reasons, the incorporation of this knowledge is important for them, but also for wider society. Now, underpinning the direct drivers of change, there is a set of underlying causes, a set of root causes of change, which are all anchored in social values, and they are all socio-economic, political in nature. We are talking about population trends, we are talking about consumption, about trade, economic trades, institutions, governance, lifestyles. These are the real causes of the situation we are seeing now. We see that in the last 50 years, the global economy grew approximately fourfold, and global trade tenfold. And there has been a dramatic increase in connectivity and movement across the world. Connectivity and movement of information, goods, waste, and people. Now, one would have thought that this increasing connectivity should have led to a more fair world, a better world, if you want. Well, unfortunately, it's not the case. Things has gone definitely well for some, but not for others. All these increases in well-being and in gross domestic product and in wealth has been mostly in high-income countries and to some degree in middle-income countries. But it has not changed much for low-income countries. What happened is that production and consumption got especially decoupled. So people who consume the most are not in the same place where things are produced. And what we found is that actually less gross domestic product is accrued per unit of resource extracted, per unit of nature destroyed in low and middle income countries than in high income countries. In other words, if you destroy 1 hectare of nature in a rich country, you get much more GDP for the country than if you destroy exactly the same bit of nature, exactly the same way in a poor country. And that is because consumers and traders don't pay for the true ecological and social cost of the goods they demand. Actually, most consumers are not even aware of those social and ecological costs because they are far away. With that picture in mind of drivers and trends, are we going to achieve some of the biodiversity and well-being goals set by the countries for the next year and the next 40 years? For the next couple of years, the answer is non-surprisingly no. Definitely not. If we look at the Aichi biodiversity targets, are you all more or less familiar with the Aichi biodiversity targets? Okay, these are the targets, the countries in the Convention of Biological Diversity set in 2010, and now they are going to assess whether they achieve it or not later this year. And of all the targets, we cannot say they weren't achieved or not. We only can say trends. They are the ones who decide whether they achieved or not, right? But if we just look at the evidence, of the 20 targets, only 4 show moderate progress. And none of these 4 has to do with the root causes of biodiversity loss. If we look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which are for 2030 and 2050, again, out of 44, 35 show negative trends. Yeah. So clearly, we are not doing very well. What about the future? What about 2050? Maybe things get slightly better in 2050. What we did was to do a very thorough review of different scenarios combining socioeconomic and emissions scenarios that combine different mixtures of population growth, energy consumption, links between countries, lifestyles, etc. And the scenarios were grouped in three families, depending on how much you consume, how clean you consume, and how countries relate to each other in trade. And we found that by 2050, in all, this is a bit complex, but I'll try to make it simple. By 2050, all scenarios show an increasing impact of climate change with respect to the other drivers. So by 2050, climate change becomes more and more and more important and compounds the effect of the other drivers. In all scenarios, there is a trade-off between increases in material contributions to people. That is, in all the scenarios, we get an increase of production of food, energy, materials, and a decrease of regulating contributions to people, such as water regulation by ecosystems, flood protection, carbon sequestration, and diversity measured as species richness, in all scenarios. And in all scenarios, we have dramatic differences between regions. Some regions do moderately well, they don't change a lot, like North America, and some regions get terrible projections, like South Africa, Southern Africa, should I say. But things get particularly bad in this scenario of high consumption and regional competition. This is the worst of all. Whereas on a scenario of global sustainability is bad, but is considerably less bad. Looking at that, what about the Sustainable Development Goals by 2050? Well, if we go business as usual, like these scenarios, most countries miss most goals by 2050. There's no physical way for most countries to meet them, right? Indeed, not only they miss it, they increasingly miss it with time. So things, again, don't look very good with business as usual. So what we do, is there any hope? Is there anything we can do? Are there any ways and any, scientifically defensive ways to achieve futures that look better? Our team found that there is a set of scenarios which are also plausible. They are not science fiction, that are compatible with the 2030 and the 2050 goals. But all of them, without exception, involve what we call, and other people call, we didn't invent the word, transformative change. What we mean by transformative change? What is needed? What's needed is an urgent and concerted effort to address the direct drivers of biodiversity change, but also, and importantly, the indirect drivers, the root causes of nature deterioration. Of course, we have to urgently address this. We need to stop deforestation, we need to pollute less, etc. That's okay, that's needed. But doing this only would be like, imagine a person who keeps jumping from the 10th floor again and again, right? And all we do is just patching him or her up with a few bandages and a few painkillers, right? It helps, it's okay. We have to give painkillers, we have to give antibiotics and bandage, but that alone is not going to solve the problem if the person keeps jumping from the roof, right? Well, it seems a brutal analogy, but it's as brutal if we try only to address the direct drivers with doing nothing at the level of the root socioeconomic causes of the situation we are now. What I mean about addressing indirect drivers, root causes? Well, it means addressing things like this. It means addressing governance, changing governance. It doesn't mean changing governments necessarily. It means changing governance of our natural resources. It needs big changes in trade and the whole supply chains. It means a much better equity between countries, between sectors in societies, between genders, between generations. Now it's mostly lip service. It means a much better cross-sectorial planning. By that, I mean coordination, for example, of the agricultural policy with the environmental policy. Often, one sector, one ministry, comes up with really good policy, but the other ministry doesn't have something similar. So they neutralize each other. You have a great new environmental policy, but the agricultural industry just keeps doing things like that and completely neutralizes the good result. The same with spatial scales. Sometimes some things that get implemented at one part of a big basin have no effect if a similar new policy is implemented in the upper basin, right? So things that seem common sense, things that have been said, 50 years ago, still not happening and have to happen, otherwise it doesn't work. A very important aspect of this transformative change has to do with stronger regulation, what we call command and control. Some things shouldn't be allowed, and government should enforce ban of things which are really bad for nature and people. But also shifting of incentives is really important. Many people say, okay, we cannot really afford a more natural, nature and people-friendly agriculture because it's too expensive, we don't have for the subsidies, or we cannot really subsidy, a great public transport system, or we cannot really subsidy, green things. We don't have the money. Actually, almost all governments have the money, if only they would shift the subsidy, the huge subsidies, from sectors which are bad for people and nature to sectors which are good for people and nature. Just a shifting of money rather than creating new funding. And of course, this is probably the hardest of them all. I say that all the indirect drivers are anchored in social values. And I think that's at the core of the model of operating the earth we have now. We all operate on social narratives. Social narratives are the stories we keep telling ourselves and others and each other that are underpinning the decisions we do about everything. And the dominant social narratives in most of the world today say that in order to be successful as a person or as a society, you need to be, bigger and faster and spend more and more and waste more and more, and move faster and faster. Those social narratives are basically incompatible with the way biology works. It's as stark as that. So there has to be at some point a shift from these social narratives to social narratives more anchored on the common good, basically. It may sound all very naive. It may sound all very kind of science fiction, but there's no other way. At least as far as we know, at least as all the scenarios we run, There's no physically and biologically sustainable scenario that gets us to somewhere we want to be in 2050 if this doesn't happen, it doesn't start happening basically now, not in 15 years, not in 20 years. It has to start very quickly. One parenthesis in all this is about environmental policy. Of course, we need better environmental policy, better policies to natural areas, natural conservation areas, but having great environmental policies only is definitely not going to be enough because of the reasons I just showed in the very beginning of the talk. The natural areas are a tiny proportion. In order to make real progress, we need to mainstream nature, meaning incorporating nature considerations and safeguards in all the major sectors of the economy, incorporating nature considerations in transport, in urban planning, in the energy policy, in the Minister of Economy, education, the legislation. The same way we mainstream human rights in all sectors of society, or increasingly gender rights, nature has to be mainstream for the whole thing to work. It seems daunting. However, there are a number, and there are many, many examples around the world that are a proof of concept that these things can work. But so far, they are too few and too small scale and too anecdotal. They just prove that this is not impossible. They just prove that it can be done. But of course, we need to dramatically increase the scale and the pace in which these things happen. And also, what people found is that there's an awful lot of really good instruments already in place, but are not enforced. So rather than completely reinventing the wheel, when reinventing the wheel is not necessary, there's a lot to do in just making sure that the good policies are enforced. Another aspect of this has to do with the links between climate change, nature deterioration, and achieving a good quality of life for all, feeding people, making that everybody has access to the basic needs. Because of the huge attention that climate change has got in the media in the last year, because of the demonstrations, because of the reports, etc., I often get asked, okay, we are all worried about climate change. Now you talk about diversity. Should we concentrate on climate, or should we concentrate on diversity? Or should we first feed people? That's a common question of journalists mostly. Well, actually, the three problems are all the symptoms of the same deep process. They are all interconnected. They are all connected by the fabric of life. And the crisis has the same root for the three of them. It's the model in which we are managing the earth. And therefore, they have to be addressed synergistically. You cannot forget diversity when trying to solve climate change. You cannot forget feeding people when trying to solve diversity. If you try to solve one alone, it's going to backfire. One example, I don't want to be too long now, but we can keep talking with whoever of you are interested, is some climate change mitigation measures that came up recently, basically large-scale land-based mitigation schemes, in particular bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. I think that's the horrible acronym, almost as horrible as Ibis. So In common terms, this means planting a lot of trees, yeah, for biofuel and for carbon sequestration. Massive, large scale. Well, what the latest reports, this time for IPCC, the land report of IPCC shows that whenever you go for a BECS, more than 1 million hectares worldwide, because BECS is not going to do anything to the climate if you just plant a patch in your neighborhood, right? It would be great for you, but it's not doing anything to the climate. In order to help mitigate change, it has to be massive scale. But the problem is, it works massive scale for carbon. But if you go beyond 1 million hectares globally, between 1 million and 3 million, then you start having a lot of negative consequences for biodiversity, food security, and water security. So you fix climate, but you ruin everything else. So there's a strong trade-off there, and people are struggling to solve it between this kind of mitigation schemes and diversity and food. I'm talking about no restoration of natural, I'm talking about plantation. And in all this landscape, again, one very important aspect is recognize all the knowledge, the practices, and the rights of the indigenous peoples and local communities that have been the stewards of many of the ecosystems for a very long time. And their knowledge is traditionally ignored in large-scale assessments. And I think it shouldn't be. First, because it enhances the quality of life and it protects their rights. But also, they have a lot of knowledge that contributes to nature conservation, and they manage a lot of land. So making sure that this is taken into account also is good for the wider society as a whole. One case in point, you probably saw all over the news in the past 2 weeks, with all the fire tragedy in Australia, that a number of policymakers in Australia are remembering that Aboriginal peoples knew how to manage fire, and apparently if more landscapes were managed like the Aboriginal people used to manage fire there, probably the fires would be there anyway, but the consequences would have been much less dramatic. Again, this is one case. There's many. I'm just using this because it's been all over the news recently. So, in a nutshell, the IPBES global assessment being the most comprehensive to date shows very clear trends, very sharp trends, and these trends are worrying, and it shows that they are clearly unsustainable. There's no doubt about it. But this shouldn't be taken as a doom and gloom message. Indeed, I think it should be taken as a call for action, because although the trends are worrying, the scenarios show that it's very difficult, but it's not physically impossible to get to a future we all want. But in order to do that, we have a very short window of opportunity. It requires prompt action, not in 20 years' time, and not at snail pace. It requires tackling the root causes of nature's deterioration, all the way to social narratives, which I realize people get nervous about it. It requires coordination and integration about sectors. And it requires something very simple but very important, that remember that nature is not only for environmentalists, but for everyone, because it's at the basis of everyone's life. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your inspiring and insightful talk. Now let's take any questions from the audience.
Thank you, Sandra. It was very enlightening. You saw the Aichi targets, and you were saying that the positive might be that we have more protected areas coverage, but it might be only on paper, right? I wonder what you think about the actual coverage and protection.
Exactly. That's one of the targets that was overachieved, actually. Is because it's easy to declare a natural protected area, right? It doesn't mean biodiversity is increasing in them. It doesn't necessarily mean biodiversity is being protected. This is what we call it technically is a response target. So it doesn't go to the root causes. It's better than nothing. I'm not saying we shouldn't be protecting more and more areas, but I'm not impressed because, okay, the number of protected areas goes like this, but biodiversity is going like this. So it's not working.
Yeah, but in this case, what you say, it depends on the region, because if we don't act very quickly to increase the protected area, scenario is going to disappear forever. Yeah. Cerrado or whatever. So I think it has to see case by case. You find that we need more protected areas in many places urgently, right? Because it's going to disappear everything very, very, very quickly.
Definitely, that's what I say. I'm not saying that they're not good, but two things. First, declaring an area protected doesn't mean it's actually protected. Maybe just on paper. No, we pretend it's protected, but it's not protected in reality. And also, even if we decided to protect, I don't know, 25% of the planet, it would be great. But it's not getting us out of the problem because the whole rest is going down the drain. So again, it's okay, but we need more, in my view.
More questions?
Hi, I'm not an environmentalist, I'm a computer scientist. I use computers. So let me ask you, is Singapore going on the right track? It says, oh, we are the green city and so much greenery, plant more plants on rooftops and everywhere. And we put a lot of solar panels, and which reflects a lot of heat around as well.
Okay, I arrived at Singapore 2 days ago, and I didn't leave campus, right? So anything I could say is completely irresponsible because the answer is I don't know. The pictures I've seen are great. It seems to be, I mean, in principle and very superficially, having, a lot of greenery in the city and a lot of greenery everywhere and being, having a great public transport system so nobody needs to use a car, that kind of things, in principle, as far as I can see, they're all great. If Singapore is going on the right track or not, I couldn't possibly say because I've been here 2 days. But maybe you can say, because you live here.
Hi, so a lot of the root causes that you're pointing to are, I mean, they're social constructs, constructs of governments and governments. In your interactions in compiling this report, are there areas that you're finding governments are very resistive to changing, or conversely that they're positive about changing?
Okay, in my own experience, governments are very happy to approve the reports and then extremely reluctant to actually do something about them, They pay lip service out. Now, they are more reluctant than others. For example, in the reserves, creative reserves, they're great. In trying to establish policies against invasive species, they're very good. In CITES, they're quite good. Yeah. What else? In what they really hate, really hate, is that you mess about with trade. And of course, that's a problem because trade is the issue. So whenever you tell, okay, about incentives, whenever you say trade cannot be like that, whenever we say we are going to extra tax things that are not sustainably produced, that very bad. Yeah. So, yes, you probably knew all the answer already. Yeah.
Hello. I'm interested to find out whether you have outlined any recommendations towards education policies with regards to your findings.
I don't know either. Yeah. Yes, I mean, we have a whole chapter in the report about education, which I don't elaborate because it's already too long. I am not a specialist, but it's definitely very important. Not, okay. Education about the importance of nature is good, but I would say most of countries already are pretty good at it. Young people and children already have a lot of knowledge about ecology, environment, whatever. More practical education is needed because some people, have all these ecosystem things in mind, but in their normal life don't know what to do. So one of the recommendations is making sure particularly urban young people and particularly urban children get exposed to nature from early childhood so they know what nature means to you. Yeah, so that's one, which is not trivial sometimes. For example, in the global south mega cities, in disadvantaged schools, it's not trivial to get the children to have a close interaction with nature. It's actually really difficult. But most of the education is the transformative one, is about not nature directly, but about different values, about caring, about having enough, not too much, about keeping, about respect for other beings, other people. It's about the social narratives rather than ecology, which is not very popular, I have to say. Most of society is educating us all the time through publicity, through the social media, to the contrary, to have more and faster, and so it's a little bit of a resistance there when we say, okay, you need to, we have to start thinking of the common good rather than having it all now.
Hi. Since like most of the root causes you mentioned are like social issues like capitalism and how the economy works and stuff like that, are there any like alternatives like other than like indigenous structures, like social structures that you think can be applied to society today? Like, what would like your society like 4.0 look like in the future that would address those scenarios that you talked about? Yeah.
I'm not sure I got the whole question. You mean if there are other alternatives too?
Like alternative social structures that could apply to society. Yeah.
Oh.
Like because you mentioned like one alternative would be like indigenous.
Oh, okay.
Like cultures
so
and things like that.
The question would be maybe whether we can learn from existing social structure, maybe from indigenous people, to apply more widely. Is that the question?
Yeah, like what are some things that can be mainstream into society, and how would society look like? Yeah.
Okay. Let me think. I guess there are many examples, particularly of collective management, that could be applied. Whether they would be, for example, the collective management of the land, there are many examples still working. It's not like we have to go archaeological. They are still working. We just have to empower them. There's a number of agroecological practices that are already being implemented to produce more food per hectare without using a lot of inputs such as fertilizer, insecticides. There's a very, very good initiatives, at least in my country, and I guess in many other countries, in which you produce large scale using completely agroecological techniques rescued from various indigenous traditions. So that's another one thing that works. Those are two that come to my mind now. I'm sure there are more. Many ways of dealing with, for example, with non-air conditioning cooling, getting from many of the cultures of Southeast Asia, from the cultures of the Middle East, all this natural management of air and water, so you don't need to freeze with air conditioning and pump CO2 to the atmosphere. So these are some examples. How a new social structure and a new world would look like, I have no idea, because I've never seen it. One has visions and say, well, things I don't want, but how it's going to work or whether it would work when scaled up, I have no idea.